Hi, it's Susan. I'm from Worldpeacefull, and this is the next part to my 9/11 series, where I'm actually going to talk about emergency powers statutes. So, setting the scene of 9/11, the planes hit the towers, mass panic, people very traumatised from this event. Now, apparently on September 14, emergency powers were evoked by George W. Bush. These are state of emergency type powers, and people might recall hearing on television some discussions around evoking these emergency powers or a state of emergency. Now, what that does in the United States is it actually suspends the Constitution. And what I've just been learning from this document that I'm looking at is that in the United States, the Constitution was suspended for 40 years because presidents kept evoking this state of emergency. Now, this perpetual war that goes on enables these types of states of emergency to be called for. Same applies to climatic emergencies as well. But the implications of suspending the Constitution means that all those rights that are in those constitutions, not just in the US but elsewhere, are not upheld at that time. So in the case of the United States, the Bill of Rights is set aside during a state of emergency because the president has powers, extraordinary powers to do things. So this has a lot of implication. Now, particularly if we're in a situation where it's certainly looking like events have been orchestrated or untruths have been told, where public is not knowing the truth of what actually a matter is about, and where suspicion is being raised now around the intention behind those in leadership. This is why values are extremely important. This is why those founding values, certainly in the United States, are absolutely critical for the confidence of the people in the government. But what's also important, I believe, is to maintain confidence in a government. What we don't want is the end of government. I want to make that really, really clear. We do not want the end of government. We do not want other parties taking over and saying we can do it better. Because the whole point of government was for the people, by the people, was the underlying, if you like, theme of it. It's not necessarily always the case because often the parties have their own agendas and they're certainly not really finding out what the public want. I can see that because I know I was never asked what I wanted at any point in my life. So that is problematic in respect of the people, and it's also symptomatic of our level of maturity as societies around the world. We've come out of eras prior to this notion of democracy that were dictatorial regimes, apart from the Indigenous, which had much more sense of community. The more organised societies, the more industrial type societies, tended to be going through phases of, kingships and lords and serfdom, and then slowly evolving rights over time as those abuses of rights became more evident and people had enough and they actually took the law into their own hands because they were suffering. So the suffering of the people is not a good thing. We don't want the people to suffer in any case because it's a very painful thing and particularly unnecessary suffering. On a higher level, on a peace level, suffering can be alleviated, but you need to have education around peace building. You have to have education around finding peace within so that you can transmute negativity to positivity in order to ensure that riots don't break out or unrest breaks out. Now, these emergency powers can be used in response to civil unrest. So I'm going to read out of this document. It's called Emergency Powers Statutes. It's actually been submitted to the US Senate. The 93rd Congress First Session, report number 93 to 549. It's called Emergency Powers Statutes. Provisions of federal law now in effect delegating to the executive extraordinary authority in time of national emergency. This was printed November 19, 1973, so it's quite a long time ago, but it's still relevant. And I'm just going to read a little bit of the intro there. Mr. Matthias, in brackets for Mr. Church, as co-chairman of the Special Committee on the termination of the national emergency, submitting the following report. It's pursuant to section RES, I guess that's Resolution 9,93D, Congress. And under the introduction, the heading is a brief history sketch of the origins of emergency powers now in force. Now, this is also relevant for Australia because Australia is following very much in tow behind the United States, and we're mirroring much of their laws, and there's also a very strong relationship between particularly the conservative and Democrat in the US, or here it's Liberal and Labor. But they're definitely tracking. Same with the UK. There seems to be very much a paralleling of laws. So we have to be aware. The only problem here in Australia is we don't have a Bill of Rights. And I heard a senator say not long ago that there will not be a Charter of Rights. And I'm just going, I was shaking my head at the time saying, yes, there should be. I completely disagree with that. And I think if we took it to vote in the community as a referendum, the society would want a Charter of Rights because we're losing our rights. So going to this document, this should give us some insight into these emergency power statutes. A majority of the people of the United States have lived all of their lives under emergency rule. For 40 years, freedoms and governmental procedures guaranteed by the Constitution have, in varying degrees, been abridged by laws brought into force by states of national emergency. The problem of how a constitutional democracy reacts to great crisis, however, far antedates the Great Depression. As a philosophical issue, its origins reach back to the Greek city-states and the Roman Republic. And in the United States, actions taken by the government in times of great crisis have, from at least the Civil War in important ways, shaped the present phenomena of a permanent state of national emergency. American political theory of emergency government was derived and enlarged from John Locke, the English political philosopher whose thought influenced the authors of the Constitution. Locke argued for the threat of national crisis unforeseen, suddenly and potentially catastrophic, required the creation of broad executive. Emergency powers to be exercised by the chief executive in situations where the legislative authority had not provided a means or procedure of remedy. Referring to emergency power in the 14th chapter of his second treatise on civil government as prerogative, Locke suggested that it should be left to the discretion of him that has the executive power, since in some governments the lawmaking power is not always in being and is usually too numerous and so too slow for the dispatch requisite to executions, and because also it is impossible to foresee, and so by laws to provide for all accidents and necessities that may concern the public, or make such laws as will do no harm. If they are executed with an inflexible rigour on all occasions and upon all persons that may come in their way, therefore there is a latitude left to the executive power to do many things of choice, which the laws do not prescribe. So it's kind of where the larger governing body is not able to respond to these events for some reason or another, or there's not the right laws in place. So it's allowing that supposed leadership, that leader, to come in and make executive decisions. A little bit like the CEO of an organisation just getting straight in there. To what extent the founding fathers adhered to this view of the executive role in emergencies is a much disputed issue. Whatever their conceptions of this role, its development in practice has been based largely on the manner in which individual presidents have viewed their office and its functions. Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft argued the proper role of the president, and perhaps their debate best expounds diametrically opposed philosophies of the presidency. In his autobiography, Roosevelt asserted his stewardship theory. My view was that every executive officer was a steward of the people, bound actively and affirmatively to do all he could for the people, and not to content himself with the negative merit of keeping his talents undamaged in a napkin. That's a funny statement. My belief was that it was not only, in brackets, the president's right, but his duty to do anything that the needs of the nation demanded, unless such action was forbidden by the Constitution or by the laws. Under this interpretation of executive power, I did and caused to be done many things not previously done by the president and the heads of departments. I did not usurp power, but I did greatly broaden the use of executive power. In other words, I acted for the common well-being of all our people, whenever and whatever measure was necessary, unless prevented by direct constitutional or legislative prohibition. Roosevelt compared this principle of stewardship to what he called the Jackson-Lincoln theory, and contrasted it to the theory ascribed to William Howard Taft. Roosevelt's ideas on the limit of presidential authority and responsibility were vigorously disputed by Taft. In lectures on the presidency delivered at Columbia University in 1915 to 1916, Taft responded that the wide field of action that would give to the executive one can hardly limit. A president can exercise no power which cannot fairly and reasonably be traced to some specific grant of power. And he cautioned that such specific grants must be either in the federal Constitution or in any act of Congress passed in pursuance thereof. There is no undefined residuum of power which he can exercise because it seems to him to be in the public interest. So you have to have a lot of confidence in that president in order to give him such powers. And the argument in some cases here is concern about the limiting of his power by Taft particularly. So you have to be sure that this person's going to make wise decisions. If he's a dictator, if he's been put in politics through a criminal element or a corporate element who have positioned him, then you're going to get decisions being made on behalf of that other who's unseen and unelected. So I'll continue on. In recent years, most scholars have interpreted the Roosevelt-Taft dispute in Roosevelt's favour. In the prevailing academic view, Roosevelt is described as active, expansionist and strong. The historical reality, in fact, does not afford such a sharp distinction between the actions of these two presidents or between their analysis of the problem of emergency powers. Taft, in his concluding remarks to his Columbia lectures, said, "Executive power is limited. So far as it is possible to limit such a power consistent with that discretion and promptness of action that are essential to preserve the interests of the public in times of emergency or legislative neglect or inaction." Thus, even Taft was disposed to employ emergency power when the need arose, but he did not wish to go beyond his own narrower conservative conception of what was meant by constitutional and legal bounds. Thus, the dispute was over where those bounds lay, rather than the nature of the office itself. Now, as I was reading that, New Orleans came into my mind, and I was remembering that Bush's response was very slow, and there was a lot of criticism after the fact that the president didn't act. So I mean, whether you're exercising executive power in the sense of emergency, a state of emergency, or not, I wonder what difference it makes if he doesn't act. But I guess if the Constitution is suspended under a state of emergency and people's rights are breached, freedom of speech, association, in the United States they've got all the amendments which are to protect people's rights. So in a state of emergency, let's just say those rights are breached, then they have no constitutional recourse because the Constitution's not active. I think that's probably the issue here, is the civil rights of the people not being protected during that state of emergency. Now, if it's gone for 40 years, that has to raise serious questions in the United States and those other countries that are connected to the US, like Australia, Canada, UK, New Zealand, in particular those Anglophile type countries, because they seem to be very much following each other. These are issues of note. Of course, in other countries there will be states of emergency, but I'm not quite certain about what their constitutions would involve. So civil rights is the key thought here, and the protection of citizens. And ironically, in a state of emergency, they're in some form of danger, which is interesting, isn't it? If there's a war that breaks out or an imminent threat. State of emergency with September 11 happened on the 14th of September. But I'll talk a little bit to that in a moment. Now, I'm just going to scan down this document a little bit. I'm not going to read all of it, but I'm going to try and flush out some of the other issues. Like, I'll just quickly go down here to Lincoln. Lincoln had drawn most heavily upon his power as Commander-in-Chief. Wilson exercised emergency powers on the basis of old statutes and sweeping new legislation, thus drawing on congressional delegation as a source of authority. So the president can ensure that whatever he's doing is meeting with congressional support or authority in this case. The most significant Wilsonian innovations was economic, including a wide array of defence and war agencies, modelled to some extent upon British wartime. So there's a British influence there. I'm just going to have a little bit more of a look at this and see what it's saying. So total economic power, I'm just scanning down here a little bit. And this is around the period of 1917, which is the First World War. So what they're saying, in the winter of 1917 to 1918, to demand a coalition war cabinet similar to that of England, Wilson forestalled Congress by proposing legislation delegating him almost total economic power, and even before legislative approval, authorised the War Industries Board to exercise extensive powers. So those powers, through that total power, can be delegated by the president to give powers to others, such in this case the War Industries Board. Subsequently, Congress enacted Wilson's measure, so the legislation followed the delegation of those extensive powers. The Overman Act, which was April 1918. The other legislation extended the economic authority of the government in numerous directions. So if you have economic, I'm just putting in some narratives here. if you have economic interests that are very powerful and you have a revolving door into and out of, in this case, the White House, could an emergency be orchestrated in order for them to get their agenda through? This has to come up for democratic discussion in any country. But we're looking at the United States at this moment, given its influence. It goes on to say that following the Allied victory, Wilson relinquished his wartime authority and asked Congress to repeal the emergency statutes enacted to fight more effectively the war. So that's what should be done, is when the state of emergency is over, those authorities have to be relinquished. But certainly what's been stated in the beginning of this document was there's been 40 years of emergency powers that just keep getting renewed. That's concerning. Goes on to say that only a food control measure and a 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act were retained. This procedure of terminating emergency powers when the particular emergency itself has in fact ended has not been consistently followed by his successors, which is just what I've said. The Great Depression, it goes on to talk about, had already overtaken the country by the time Roosevelt's inauguration and confronted him with a totally different crisis. This emergency, unlike those of the past, presented a non-military threat. The Roosevelt administration, however, conceived the economic crisis to be a calamity equally as great as a war, and employed the metaphor of war to emphasise the Depression's severity. I mean, is that a fair mirroring of war and a depression? Are they simply looking at, well, assuming if a country's been attacked, but the United States fought its wars outside its own country, apart from the Civil War. So if we're looking at poverty is what I'm thinking about in a Great Depression, because there's no work. Most of the people are unemployed. And there's unrest because people are hungry. There could be more theft, that sort of thing. Could one consider that similar to a war-type crisis? Goes on to say, in his inaugural address, Roosevelt said, "I shall ask the Congress for one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency." See, there's the militarised thinking. As great as the power that would be given me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. That doesn't sound congruent to me. Now again, what happens if that depression is deliberately orchestrated by private banks? Let's say they withhold currency. Let's say they put up interest rates in order to stop people borrowing money, to stall the economy. Now, this is a private sector bank. It's a Federal Reserve in the United States. This is not a government bank. Let's say it's in their interests to create the conditions through not making credit available, not making money available, increasing interest rates, and then having things collapse, and then property is transferred to them. If they're unethical within that private banking system, what then? So what I'm really saying here, and these are just scenarios I'm putting, I'm not saying that's a fact, that's what happened. I'm just saying that I'm using just examples of possible negative behaviour deliberately orchestrating what would be constituted as a state of emergency for their own interests. So problem solving that problem, those skills in being able to sift out what is going on here. Do we need a state of emergency, or is it a question of espionage? Is it corrupt behaviour that's actually orchestrating what appears to be an emergency for other interests? Or is it a genuine state of emergency where Congress, in this case, is not able to quickly make decisions that need to be made in order to be able to sort the problem out quite quickly. There's no time to consult. But one has to be very careful about initiating something like that because poor decision making can happen. And anyone that's done any reading into history can see that mistakes were made in various situations that may not have been thought through very well, or there may have been particular interests involved, or it required far more debate, because that's what the purpose of the democracy is about. It's like an agora. It's like a Greek agora. It's to get them talking. It's to have competing and contrasting viewpoints in order to make better quality decisions. So when a state of emergency is orchestrated or is announced, those functions of government, which are supposed to have checks and balances in them, are suspended. And one person, in more like a dictatorial state of being, is then able to make those decisions. But there's no real oversight, and that's the danger with it. What decrees are going to be made? Is it truly in the public interest? Or is it poor decision making? Or is it maybe it's a brilliant decision that gets made as a result of that person really being a great strategist, a person who's a great leader, who really is representing the people? In that case, it could be fine. So I'm just posing some thoughts here for consideration, for reflection. Now, I'm just going to go down a little bit further, and this is to do with the banking area. It says, in his first important official act, Roosevelt proclaimed a national bank holiday on the basis of the 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act, itself a wartime delegation of power. New Deal historian William E. Leuchtenberg writes, when he sent his banking bill to Congress, the House received it with much the same and awe as if had greeted Woodrow Wilson's war legislation. Ardour. I didn't read that properly. I'll read that again, actually. When he sent his banking bill to Congress, the House received it with much the same ardour as it had greeted Woodrow Wilson's war legislation. Speaker Rainey said the situation reminded him of the late war when, on both sides of his chamber, the great war measures suggested by the administration were supported with practical unanimity. Today we are engaged in another war, more serious even in its character and presenting greater dangers to the Republic. After only 38 minutes of debate, the House passed the administration's banking bill. These last two words are critical. Sight unseen. So what it means is legislation can get passed without appropriate oversight. In this case, no sight. No one looked at it. 38 minutes of debate's hardly going to flush up problems with it. So these mechanisms of calling for states of emergency couldn't actually pass in legislation. Now, what if he was supported by a financial lobby? You know, we know that in Treasury in the United States, Goldman Sachs comes in and out. What if they're influencers? Lehman Brothers. I mean, it goes on. There's a huge list. I could reel off a huge list of corporations that are involved in donations and all the rest of it. So this is very, very important. I'm going to just read on a little bit further as well. You might be interested to learn that at the end of the Korean War, moreover, the official state of emergency was not terminated. It is not yet terminated. This may be primarily attributed to the continuance of the Cold War atmosphere, which, until recent years, made the imminent threat of hostilities an accepted fact of everyday life, with emergency the normal state of affairs. In this, what is, for all practical purposes, permanent state of emergency? Presidents have exercised numerous powers, most notably under the Trading with the Enemy Act, legitimated by the ongoing state of national emergency. So it can affect who businesses trade with, trading with the enemy. So whoever they stipulate, they can use this type of state of emergency to actually influence business to not trade with a certain country. They can direct that. So under a normal constitutional situation, they can't stop anybody from trading with anybody. They can place sanctions and what have you to make it very difficult to trade, make it very expensive to trade. But this is actually an ability that you cannot trade with them. And I do believe Trump said that recently to his people, that they couldn't trade with China. So that's a political situation of a trade war where businesses are being directed who you can trade with, who you can't. That's very interesting. That's a suspension of a freedom in that I choose who I trade with. He also utilised the idea of the Mexican situation with the wall as a potential state of emergency, even though there is no imminent threat coming from Mexico. But he clearly wanted to utilise a state of emergency in order for him to just do what he wants. So what do you do in that situation? So there's a lot of questions here. So it says, besides the 1933 and Korean War emergencies, 2 other states of declared national emergency remain in existence. On March 23, 1970, confronted by a strike of postal service employees, President Nixon declared a national emergency. This is the postal service. So no mail was being, I'm assuming that was a strike. So this is a union type situation. He's then saying this is a state of emergency. In actual fact, it's an industrial dispute. The emergency side of it is that no mail is moving, let's say. Yet in truth, it's a problem that needs to be solved. Why did the strike happen? I'm assuming it's to do with wages, and I've certainly seen the wages in the US, which are pretty low. Creates great inequity. We've got people at the top end getting a lot of money and people at the bottom end getting next to nothing. So your inequity is designed into our income on the basis of what we do, and that's not necessarily activities that could be critical activities like working in a nursing home, helping the elderly. That's actually a critical area of work. It's absolutely necessary, because if those people don't get assisted, and they're very skilled, the emotional intelligence that's used in dealing with people who are in this type of situation, they're highly skilled, and yet they're paid very little because it's seen as a domestic type work. And yet an accountant could be paid anything up to 100,000 or more. Say 50 to 100,000, just to give it a ballpark, depends. And yet that would just be accounting, which is counting the beans. That's seen as worth more. So our values system is what determines who gets this and who gets that. What do we value? Do we valuing profit or something that generates profit? We're not necessarily valuing the absolute social needs that need to be met in order to create a civilised society. That's a whole nother matter. What's a civilised society compared to an economic system? Who are we in relationship to serving our community? Who is the constituency that we serve? Are we biased? Are we serving certain interests because that's business as usual? That's the way it's done. And if you don't do it, you won't survive. Now, I'm going to read you something else that's very interesting. It says, since 1933, Congress has passed and recodified over 470 significant statutes delegating to the President powers that had been the prerogative and responsibility of the Congress. Since the beginning of the Republic, no charge can be sustained that the executive branch had usurped powers belonging to the legislative branch. On the contrary, the transfer of power has been in accord with due process of normal legislative procedures. It is fortunate that at this time, that when the fears and tensions of the Cold War are giving way to relative peace and detente, is now national policy. Congress can assess the nature, quality and effect of what has become known as emergency power legislation. Emergency powers make up a relatively small but important body of statutes. Some 470 significant provisions of law out of total of tens of thousands that have been passed or recodified since 1933. But emergency powers laws are of such significance to civil liberties, to the operation of domestic and foreign commerce, and the general functioning of the US government, that in microcosm they reflect dominant trends in the political, economic and judicial life in the United States. A number of conclusions can be drawn from the Special Committee's study and analysis of emergency powers laws now in effect. Congress has, in most important respects, except for the final action of floor debate and the formal passage of bills, permitted the executive branch to draft and in large measure to make the laws. This has occurred despite the constitutional responsibility conferred on Congress by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which states that it is Congress that makes all laws. So the point being made there is that the executive, the president, can make the laws under a state of emergency. I'm going to just say something really silly here just for the sake of demonstrating a point. He makes a law that anyone wearing glasses is considered a second-class citizen. And the reason I'm saying that is because I remember Pol Pot in Cambodia, who had an ideology where the bourgeoisie were a threat to that power, and they wanted to create an agrarian society. So that's a society where people are not educated, people are slaves. They scared them out into the countryside by saying that there was going to be a nuclear attack on Phnom Penh. That's how they moved hundreds of thousands, if not millions, I guess hundreds of thousands, out of Phnom Penh into the countryside. Then they had them working hard labour out in the countryside. Anyone that was considered an enemy of the state, and that is anyone that criticised the Khmer Rouge, anyone that was considered a traitor, any disloyalty was dealt with either by execution, the killing fields. I went to the killing fields and I saw the graves. I saw all the skulls. There's a very interesting exhibition. It's very sad, but it's a lot of skulls all piled up on top of each other where people were murdered by the regime. I won't go into some of the things I learned because it was pretty horrible. And in Phnom Penh itself, I went to a converted school where this was a torture chamber. Now, when I walked through this torture chamber, because all the school classrooms were turned into torture spaces, people were not allowed to cry or scream out. I saw a sign out the front of this school, which they'd kept there by Pol Pot's order at the time, that you could not cry or scream. Imagine that. You're being tortured, possibly to death. Some of them would have died. Some of the torture techniques were just horrendous, and I won't go into it, but I'll just go in as far as saying that the energy was so heavy in this place that I needed to go and have a shower. I remember that distinctly. I have a section in my book, A Fool for Peace. You can download it as a PDF or you can buy it as an ebook on my website, Worldpeacefull, worldpeacefull.com. Just go to author. I talk about my experience at Tuol Sleng prison. I saw all the photos of grandparents, parents, children who had been through this prison. I actually met one of the sole survivors, who was an artist who the head of that prison favoured because he liked what he did. He was the one that survived. People were killed, they were tortured, some of them to death, others were taken out to the killing fields and finished off there. Now, this was totalitarian regime that brooks no challenge. These people were starved to death. Many of them died of starvation. About 1 million people died under this ideology where the leader was convinced this was the way for the people, but he imposed a very violent, very repressive regime on these people, complete control. He was not going to be listening to feedback. He was not interested in their rights. He was not interested in their needs. The people were so traumatized. I actually went to they call it the ECCC. It was a chamber. It was a UN legal court that was set up to try the top 5 of them, 5 of these leaders. Most people in Cambodia had lost someone. So this is what I'm describing here is a very extreme and totalitarian side of absolute power. It can be, if that person is not balanced, if that person has mental health issues, if that person is rigid, is cruel, does not want feedback or critique, then people's lives are at stake. They're very dangerous people. So you have to be very careful about these types of things if we want to ensure that the public interest is protected. Now, it goes on to say, so it's saying here, I'm just going to read this little bit about the civil liberties. Most of the statutes pertaining to emergency powers were passed in times of extreme crisis. Bills drafted in the executive branch were sent to Congress by the President. And in the case of the most significant laws that ate on the books, don't know why it says that, could be a typo, seems strange, were approved with only the most perfunctory committee review and virtually no consideration of their effect on civil liberties or the delicate structure of the US government of divided powers. For example, the economic measures that were passed in 1933 pursuant to the proclamation of March 5, 1933 by President Roosevelt, asserting that a state of emergency now existed, were enacted in the most turbulent circumstances. There was a total of only 8 hours of debate in both houses. There were no committee reports. Indeed, only one copy of the bill was available on the floor. This pattern of hasty and inadequate consideration was repeated during World War II, when another group of laws were vitally significant and far-reaching implications were passed. It was repeated during the Korean War and again in most recent memory during the debate on the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, passed on August 6. On occasion, legislative history shows that during the limited debates that did take place, a few but very few objections were raised by senators and congressmen that expressed serious concerns about the lack of provision of the congressional oversight. So there was, people are not critiquing things. They're not thinking. I mean, this could also be the quality of those people selected for Congress and the Senate in this case. So few objections were raised by senators and congressmen that expressed serious concerns about the lack of provision. So why is that? That's something worth exploring. Maybe they don't understand their role in respect of oversight and the importance that they have a neutral and that their orientation is in the public interest first and foremost. And certainly critiques of government these days is saying the opposite, saying that their allegiances are more associated with whoever's donating to them, and it can even be foreign countries that are getting in there as well. So those values and ethics are really essential in the body politic. It goes on to say their speeches raised great doubts about the wisdom of giving such open-ended authority to the president, with no practical procedural means to withdraw that authority once the time of emergency had passed. For example, one of the very first provisions passed in 1933 was the Emergency Banking Act, based upon Section 5B of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917. The provisions gave to President Roosevelt, with the full approval of the Congress, the authority to control major aspects of the economy, an authority which had formerly been reserved to the Congress. A portion of that provision, still in force, is quoted here to illustrate the kind of open-ended authority Congress had given to the president during the past 40 years. And it just states, 1, during the time of war or during any other period of national emergency declared by the president may, through any agency that he may designate or otherwise, and under such rules and regulations as he may prescribe by means of instructions, licenses, or otherwise, and there's a dash, goes down to A, investigate, regulate, or prohibit any transactions in foreign exchange, transfers of credit or payments between, by, through, or to any banking institution, and the importing, exporting, hoarding, melting, or earmarking of gold or silver, coin or bullion, currency or securities, and investigate, this is B, investigate, regulate, direct, and compel, nullify, void, prevent, or prohibit any acquisition, holding, withholding, use, transfer, withdrawal, transportation, importation, or exportation of, or dealing in, or exercising any right, power, or privilege with respect to, don't you love all this language, or transactions involving any property in which any foreign country or a national thereof has an interest. So they can control around that property, they can control around gold and silver and bullion, foreign exchange, credit. So they can stop that credit. They can make it very difficult. They might even be able to select certain people and cut off their money as a means of coercion. Maybe that person's dissenting, who knows? So it goes on to say, by any person or with respect to any property subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, and any property or interest of any foreign country or national thereof shall vest when, as, and upon the terms directed by the President in such agency or person as may be designated from time to time by the President, and upon such terms and conditions as the President may prescribe, such interest or property shall be held, used, administered, liquidated, sold, or otherwise dealt with in the interest of and for the benefit of the United States, and such designated agency or person may perform any and all acts incident to the accomplishment or furtherance of these purposes, God, and the President shall, in the manner herein above provided, require any person to keep a full record of and to furnish under oath, I'm wanting to stop here, in the form of reports or otherwise complete information relative to any act or transaction referred to in this subdivision, either before, during, or after completion. Bear with me as I try and put up with this as well. Or relative to any interest in foreign property, or relative to any property in which any foreign country or any national thereof has or has had anger interest, or as may be otherwise necessary to enforce the provisions of this subdivision. I'm stopping it there because that's a lot of wordsmithing. It doesn't engage the public. I mean, who wrote that? a lawyer. It's all contractual type information. And that's what turns everyone off. That's why they don't read the legislation. They can't stand all this gobbledygook. It's not written in language that people understand. And I'm not going to torment the listener here by reading more of that. You'll have to, what I'll do is I'll put a link to this document. It's worth having a look over it. But it's, the point it's making really is that under these state of emergency powers, he can seize assets. He can do anything with the money system, gold and silver. People can be affected by that president directly. Could be an enemy of the president. You don't know. Or it could be good decisions, just to give them the benefit of the doubt. There might be important economic decisions that need to be made, and he has to divert resources from one industry to another in order to meet that threat. And I'm going to talk a bit about threats a little bit as we go on. Well, I'm getting on to the hour here. God, it doesn't take long. So I guess the point's being made here, but I do want to read something else out to you. So Harry S. Truman, I believe, is mentioned in here as well. And sort of, I guess through that, because this is a document from the Senate, so it's got Harry S. Truman there by the president, and the seal of the United States is affixed to these emergency powers. I'm just going to see if there's anything else that you need to hear about. Got something here on Hitler, I think. Habeas corpus. Now that's interesting. Okay, we may also suspect that they suspected that emergency powers would tend to kindle emergencies. Kindle. Aside from suspension of the privileges of the writ of habeas corpus, that means being put in front of a judge within 24 hours, which is the right to a fair hearing. They can suspend that. In time of rebellion or invasion, when the public safety may require it, they made no express provision for exercising of extraordinary authority because of a crisis. I do not think we rightfully may so amend their work, and if we could, I am not convinced it would be wise to do so, although many modern nations have forthrightly recognised that war and economic crisis may upset the normal balance between liberty and authority. Very, very, very important consideration is liberty, which is freedom, and authority. And I've certainly heard it being peddled out that in order for us to feel security, so authority being changed to security, we have to give up liberties, freedoms. I don't agree with that at all. The balance between liberty and authority, I understand in the sense of what government states, how that government reaches into people's lives, and whether that's a legitimate interference in people's lives compared to the freedom of movement, the freedom of speech, the freedom to, work, the freedom that they enjoy in a democratic society. So whenever those freedoms get limited because of powers evoked by a government, like freedom of speech, for example, if legislation comes in to curtail freedom of speech, that then means a person can get criminalised if those laws are very rigid. People get shut down. People may not know that they don't have those rights anymore. In Australia, there are implied rights, but we don't have a Bill of Rights. So it makes us as citizens very vulnerable to government imposing legislation. And if they're not coming from a public interest perspective, they're coming from other interests, then the civilians, the citizens, may be in difficult circumstances where they don't have appropriate protections. So you can see there's lots of issues to all of this. It says here, Just trying to find it a little bit on Germany. Germany, after the First World War, framed the Weimar Constitution designed to secure her liberties in the Western tradition. However, the President of the Republic, without concurrence of the Reichstag, which is the German parliament, was empowered temporarily to suspend any or all individual rights if public safety and order were seriously disturbed or endangered. This proved a temptation to every government, whatever its shade of opinion, and in 13 years, suspension of rights was invoked on more than 250 occasions. I didn't know that. Finally, Hitler persuaded President von Hindenburg to suspend all such rights, and they were never restored. I didn't know that. The French Republic provided for a very different kind of emergency government, known as the state of siege. It differed from the German emergency dictatorship, particularly in that emergency powers could not be assumed at will by the executive, but could only be granted as a parliamentary measure. And it did not, as in Germany, result in the suspension or abrogation of law, but was a legal institution governed by special legal rules and terminable by parliamentary authority. I like that. Now I'm feeling more comfortable. Great Britain also has fought both world wars under a sort of temporary dictatorship created by legislation. As Parliament is not bound by written constitutional limitations, it established a crisis government simply by delegation to its ministers of a larger measure than usual of its own unlimited power, which is exercised under its supervision by ministers whom it may dismiss. This has been called the high water mark in the voluntary surrender of liberty. But as Churchill put it, Parliament stands custodian of these surrendered liberties, and its most sacred duty will be to restore them to their fullness when victory has crowned our exertions and our perseverance. Thus, parliamentary controls made emergency powers compatible with freedom. So, assuming that they honour what's been stated here, that they do restore those liberties, they suspend them for a time but restore them, this gives Parliament some control here. So this is the balance. You don't just hand over all your powers to one person and then let them reinstate that for 40 years when it suspends, in the case of the United States Bill of Rights. That's very concerning. So I might just leave it there on that one. I do want to continue on a little bit longer because I'm just going to read you an article. I know we're going up to the hour mark, but bear with me. This is actually, again, a more current document. You will find it interesting. It's called Obama Renews Bush's 9/11 State of Emergency. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of this situation. And, of course, we already know with Donald Trump that there's been talk about state of emergency. So this is relevant. This is by Lewis Sealer and Dan Hamburg. commondreams.org is the website. On September 10th, President Obama reinstituted the national state of emergency first declared by George W. Bush on September 14, 2001, by placing the following language in the Federal Register. The terrorist threat that led to the declaration on September 14, 2001 of a national emergency continues. For this reason, I have determined that it is necessary to continue in effect after September 14, 2009, the national emergency with respect to the terrorist threat. As Dr. Harold C. Relay, R-E-L-Y-E-A, a specialist in national government with the Congressional Research Service of the Library of Congress, has written, and quoted, when the President formally declares a national emergency, he may seize property, organise and control the means of production, seize commodities, assign military forces abroad, institute martial law, seize and control all transportation and communication, regulate the operation of private enterprise, restrict travel, and in a variety of ways control the lives of United States citizens. Yet while Dr. Relayi opines that Congress and the judiciary, as well as public opinion, and end quote, can restrain the executive regarding emergency powers, end quote, nothing of the sort has occurred. Under the 1976 National Emergencies Act, in brackets 50 U.S.C. 1601-1651, close brackets, Congress is required to review presidentially declared emergencies. Specifically, and in quotes, not later than 6 months after national emergency is declared and not later than the end of each 6-month period thereafter that such emergency continues, each House of Congress shall meet to consider a vote on a joint resolution to determine whether that emergency shall be terminated, close quote. Over the past 8 years, Congress has failed to obey its own law, a fact that casts doubt on the legality of the state of emergency. As far as public opinion is concerned, how many Americans are even aware that a state of emergency even exists? For that matter, how many members of Congress know? Homeland Security Committee member Peter DeFazio took to the House floor in late 2007 to express his anger at being denied access to an executive branch document, in brackets the National Security Presidential Directive 51 or NSPD-51, close brackets, that established a comprehensive national policy for the continuity of federal government structures in a national emergency. The New York Times in 2007 editorial titled "Making Martial Law Easier" offered these words regarding NSPD-51, and in quotes, beyond cases of actual insurrection, the President may now use military troops as a domestic police force in response to a natural disaster, a disease outbreak, terrorist attack, or to any other condition. Changes of this magnitude should be made only after a thorough public airing. It's noteworthy that this particular Times editorial was written a year before NORTHCOM, in quotes, Unified Combat Command of the US military, close quotes, covering the US, Canada, and Mexico, began stationing troops on US soil. Established a year after 9/11, NORTHCOM is the first such command to cover the domestic battlefield. Even though that wording is concerning, because they're seeing it as a battlefield, preempting that there's going to be conflict. It is charged with the protection of the United States homeland and the support of local, state, and federal authorities. In 1878, Congress passed the Posse Comitatus Act with the intention of substantially limiting the powers of the federal government to use the military for law enforcement. By 2008, however, the 3rd Infantry's 1st Brigade Combat Team has been stationed at Fort Stewart in Georgia. This force, known as the Consequence Management Response Force, may be called upon to help with civil unrest and crowd control or to deal with potentially horrific scenarios. Plans for the stationing of more brigades are swiftly being enacted, as the Army Times pointed out. In quotes, this mission marks the first time an active unit of the US military has been given a domestic assignment, close quotes. The demise of Posse Comitatus, a critical protection for ordinary citizens from the predations of overreaching government, has occurred without media comment or public resistance. Despite campaign pronouncements that cheered civil libertarians, President Obama has largely maintained Bush-era policies regarding rendition, torture, surveillance, and preventative detention. The denial of what has often been called the great writ of habeas corpus should send a shudder down the spine of every American citizen. So as I said, habeas corpus is being put before a judge within 24 hours. If you've been accused of something, you have to be put before a judge. The United States Constitution states in Article 1, Section 5 that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. So only in extreme situations where it's impossible to put someone before a judge would be my reading of that. Like there's a calamity going on, you can't do it. The Obama administration is essentially arguing that the United States is currently in a state of resisting foreign invasion in full 8 years after the attacks of 9/11. So a full 8 years later, that's still being asserted. Goes on to say this is ludicrous. Dr. Relaya argues that Congress and the judiciary, as co-equal branches of constitutional government, serve as a check on the executive power, and that's a critical point. Congress and the judiciary are a check and balance to that power. This is so they don't get out of control. If you've got yourself a megalomaniac or someone that's totalitarian or someone that's paid for by corporate, someone very powerful who may not be a corporate, they might be part of the global elite, for example. You may have yourself a really big problem if you lose the ability of Congress to oversight and you're not able to utilize the judiciary. But then you've also got problems with judicial appointments by politicians or political parties. That should never occur. No one should be appointing a conservative this or a left-wing that. All judges should be appointed on the basis of their ability to be neutral and able to interpret the law, but in a way that's fair. Because obviously anything that's enshrining language, and these are legislative approaches often to social issues. So the law itself is incongruent with complex social problems. If it's a question of breaching a law, like someone breaks into something and steals something, that's more straightforward. But if it's undermining or bullying or, over time something very difficult to detect and prove, you need to have a wise judge sitting up there who's had a lot of experience. So the appointment of judges should be on the basis of merit, not political affiliation, not religious affiliation. They can have faith by all means, but they're not there as supporting those of a particular religion who may well have a very strong influence in that political process, particularly if they're working together. If they're working together as a religious group, then you've got a problem with losing the secular nature of a government. That's very concerning because the whole idea of secular state is to separate religion from government, from the state, because ideologies come in that are shared and then they become the dominant paradigm rather than a government being elected because it's speaking to the people and they're voting them in on the basis of what they're saying that the people believe reflect them. Now, if they carry through with what they state they believe in, then people have a faith in that government. If they just say it in order to get elected and they have other agendas, then people lose faith in the government. This is when you lose your democracy. And yet that democracy is so fundamental for social stability. It's so fundamental for the growth in civilization because you're sharing power. You're giving freedoms, and that enables that creativity, the real excellence in humankind to flourish when people feel free to, study, feel free to attempt, different businesses, have access to money so that they can really develop what their visions are. That is the purpose of all of this. but it gets lost in translation when economics becomes a priority, when suddenly the whole ideological narrative becomes about making money, becomes about economic growth. It doesn't talk to the advancement of civilization, the advancement of humanity. It shifts, and that's what we've also seen. So going back to this story here, what was just said was that an eight years after 9/11, Obama is still, in this case, reinstating a state of emergency. Goes on to say, again, as I've pointed out, those checks and balances disappear. It says, as we have seen, Congress has either been shut down out of this process, or, as in so many cases, it has capitulated. Dr. Relaya then offers that public opinion can restrain the executive, but the public doesn't even know they're living under a state of emergency. And this is where ignorance control of the media comes in. We need to have entities in the public media and private media who are able to bring up issues and educate the public. Public don't even know they're living under a state of emergency. The media, it says, doesn't report it, and the government is certainly not in the business of providing information that might raise the hackles of real Americans. It's time for the American people to rise to this challenge, they state. Write your member of Congress and your senators. So, yeah, public participation is absolutely essential. This person's recommending that they tell them to obey their own laws. God, it shouldn't just be telling them. You have to get on the street with that. Tell them to end this phony and treacherous state of emergency that imperils the freedom of us all. And that's the people who wrote this. Lewis Sealer is the president of Voice of the Environment. It's an environmentalist. The other guy is Dan Hambu, a former US congressman from California, is executive director of Voice of the Environment. I find that really important too, that these guys are the ones that have written this article, because of the environmental situation is another national emergency. Homelessness is a state of emergency as far as I'm concerned. If you're a person who's living in homelessness, you can't access food or shelter, you're actually in strife. But yet no one responds to it as an emergency, interestingly enough, because they're not worth the same. People don't feel the empathy towards them. So going back to this whole discussion has been about the evoking of a state of emergency powers, which revokes civil liberties. It suspends judicial and parliamentary oversight, or Congress in the case of the United States. So the checks and the balances are removed under a state of emergency. It then power concentrates with the one person. And because of what we're seeing in the world today, more and more corruption in politics, these things can be created. And then we've got Homeland Security in Australia, we've got Home Affairs. We're seeing, I certainly here in Australia, I've seen military people in Darwin dealing with what looked like a sort of a civil thing, although I think the person they were dealing with was possibly, no, I think the person went on a rampage, and you could see military figures there, and I noted that because I thought, why are the military involved in a civil issue? So similar to the United States, Australia is also setting up this type of internal policing. We've also got intelligence services connected to that. And then we've got the bigger issue of surveillance of citizens. We've got other issues of massive concentration of wealth within certain industries and disproportionate influence by those people. If they're buying politicians, well, they'll then get their voice heard. If we've got overseas interests who have strong interests in affecting situation here, that can happen. And states of emergency can then be created, and people can be suppressed. And if they're of a totalitarian persuasion that doesn't bode well for democracy. So going back to my theme, and I'll finish up here in a few moments, of 9/11, 14th of September was when George W. Bush suspended the Bill of Rights, the Constitution in the United States, under the state of emergency powers. That was the very same day that the Saudis left the country. If you listen to my previous video, I've gone in great length and talked about the people who were allowed to leave the United States when the rest of the airspace was shut down. So clearly that one individual allowed those others to leave the country only when he announced a state of emergency. And of course, as was stated in this discussion I had before, there's real questions around external influences such as the Saudis, the relationship with the Bush family, the oil oligarchy interests, the project for a new American century, which needed to create a Pearl Harbor-like event in order to increase defence spending. And then we ended up with the narrative around terrorism. And then there's talk around who's funding them and some suspicion around it being an internal problem in order to maintain that state of fear, which then opens up markets to energy people and various contractors. So I think there's really serious issues around all of this that are coming out more and more. There was concerns around the 9/11 Commission by those who were actually in that commission, who felt that it didn't do its job properly and there were influences that were affecting the outcome of that commission. So things like ethics and values and true representation of the people are really under the spotlight here. And the vulnerability of the people to these states of emergencies being imposed where they lose their liberties and where the military get deployed in civilian areas. And as is my topic, and I will come to this topic, the targeting of civilians is where my real concern is if they dissent and they are considered an enemy of the state. That to me is an issue that needs to be put on the table for public discussion. Given in our country, certainly in Australia, we don't have a Bill of Rights, so people are not protected. What happens if people become identified under a labelling of combatant because they're part of some group which is, well, if they're violent, I mean, I'm no fan of any violent anything. I don't believe in violence. I'm a non-violence advocate myself. Gandhi is who I predominantly have studied. So non-violence to me is the real power. But people can get, if there's a redefinition of combatant, and it can include someone who's a cook, or it can include someone that somehow supplied something to that group that they may not have even known they're violent, then they can be targeted, is a possibility sitting here. So I'm going to talk more about the laws in respect of civilians, because ultimately the real interest here is the health and safety of civilians, and to ensure that their true voice is heard and that governments are reflecting them. And as I said in the very beginning of this, I don't want to see a dismantling of government. I actually think we definitely need good government. What I believe has to happen is a deepening of democracy and those representatives actually reflecting internal and integrated beliefs in their role as representatives of the people, and that they take that seriously. And when they stand for office, they're not being organised by faceless others who have agendas, but they're actually civil servants coming into the political process because they feel they want to serve their society. That's the sort of governments we really want. And when that occurs, we talk about greatness, we will see real greatness. So I'll leave you with that. It's been a very long video, as mine are, but I hope it's been informative for you and something to consider. The state of emergency. We need to really talk about it. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned to the next video, which will also be continuing on with my 9/11 theme.